There we go. Thanks, Nicole, for picking up moderating duties while I lost power and internet for a few minutes. So, Annie, are you ready to rock and roll?
Hey, Joe. Yep, I'm all ready. Can you
Perfect.
hear me?
Let me introduce you. Yes, we can hear you, and then I'll turn it back to you. All right, everybody, it's 12:30. With us is Annie Klodd. I think many of you probably already know her. She's a statewide extension educator for fruit crops at the University of Minnesota. She works with grape growers and other fruit growers to enhance production of cold, hardy fruit with an emphasis on grapes. Annie received her master's degree to study in viticulture at Penn State University in 2015, and she is originally from Iowa and grew up in a vineyard just west of Indianola. So Annie, I'll turn it to you, and you want questions at the end. Is that what I understood?
I think questions at the end would be easier. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
All yours.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for having me here today, you guys. I wish we could be here in person like last year. I really enjoyed coming down to the conference last year and meeting everyone in person, but I know that that's not possible this year, so maybe next year. But thank you for having me. And I'm going to be talking about how to interpret a soil and a foliar test today and how to calculate fertilizer rates based on that. Pointer there. So here's what I hope to cover today. First, okay, and I have to move, sorry, Joe's little, the window that says Joe, I need to move that out of the way so I can see my whole slides. All right, so we're gonna learn how to interpret a soil test or a tissue test report, and then how to determine from that which nutrients you need to add to your vineyard and how much. And then learn what fertilizer options are available and learn how to calculate fertilizer rates based on the nutrient recommendations from the test and based on the fertilizer that you choose to use. And I'm not sure how many people on this call today have done any foliar testing or soil testing, or how many of you regularly add nutrients to your vineyard. I'm guessing that varies a lot. If it's anything like Minnesota, you know, a lot of people have added fertilizer to their vineyard, but maybe not every year. All the way to some people will add multiple fertilizers through foliar feeds throughout the season. So the amount and the habits and the amount of fertilizer that grape growers in the Midwest are adding is really variable. But my hope is that from this presentation, you are encouraged to think about your fertilizer strategy based on a prescription. By using data and using the soil tests and foliar tests that you do in order to apply the right amounts and right types of fertilizers to your vineyard. Because the only way to know if your vines are really getting the nutrients they need is to do a foliar and a soil test. And soil testing doesn't need to be done every year. It just needs to be done every few years, especially before you plant the vineyard. It's really important. But then about 3 to 5 years after that. Or if you add a lot of fertilizer, then you do another soil test after that to see if it worked. Foliar testing is something that we like to do every year. These two types of tests, they allow you to give your vines the right prescription of amendments. Amendments meaning fertilizers and something like sulfur or lime to change the pH, rather than just giving them a set program or mix of nutrients every year. You need to know that you're putting the right amounts on and the right types on to meet the particular situation in your vineyard, because each vineyard is unique. It requires a unique set of fertilizers and rates of those fertilizers. So if you talk to a really experienced grower in Iowa who's been growing grapes for a long time and you ask them, what fertilizer do you put on your vineyard? They're probably going to give you a good answer because they've been doing it for a long time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you should be doing for your vineyard, because you're growing on two very different sites. You might have a totally different soil type from that other grower who you're talking to. Your soil might have a totally different pH. Maybe you're growing different varieties. Maybe the varieties they're growing are very low vigor and they might need more nutrients to really pump them up. Whereas maybe you're growing a lot of Frontenac. It's very vigorous and maybe it's growing well on its own without a lot of fertilizer to help it out. So it really varies from case to case, and that's why it's important to do these tests and then interpret them in a way that they can help you decide what fertilizer to apply. What we're not going to be talking about today is how to take a soil sample or how to take a foliar sample. We're going to be focusing on, once you get your test report back, then what do you do? But if you're someone who wants a refresher on how to take a soil test, I would recommend looking at this video We shot this video about 1.5 years ago, and it just leads you through how to take a sample and submit it to the lab. So this one is for soil sampling. I'm not going to play it. I didn't mean for that to happen. And then this video is for foliar sampling. So the easiest way to find these is just to Google or go on YouTube and enter this term, and those are the titles of the videos, so they'll come up easily that way. How do I get it to go to the next slide? There we go. All right, so let's start with what nutrients you should be looking at when you do soil and foliar testing in your vineyard. These 3 nutrients listed here are called our primary macronutrients. That means, when I say macro, it means that the vines are using a lot of these nutrients, and they're really important for vital processes that go on in the vines in order to go from planting to leaf production to fruit production and getting good yields. And so this first one on the left is potassium. The abbreviation for potassium, if you're not familiar, is K. And then nitrogen over here on the right, N, and phosphorus right below nitrogen on the periodic table, and we abbreviate that with P. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using N, P, and K a lot, and just remember what those stand for if you're not familiar with those yet. If you look at a lot of fertilizer packaging that you'll see, maybe even if you just go to Menards or Earl May and you're looking at fertilizer packaging, you'll often see these 3 sets of numbers. In this case, on this all-purpose fertilizer from Jack's, this is a 20-20-20, and that means it contains 20% nitrogen, 20% phosphorus, and 20% potassium. So whenever you see these 3 numbers in a row, those are our NPK ratios of that fertilizer. And then we have our secondary macronutrients and our micronutrients. And, you know, there are a lot of these, but these 5 here on the left are those that are most important for grape production. So we've got boron, B, calcium, which is Ca over on the left, magnesium, right on top of calcium. And we've got manganese, iron, and zinc. All right. So that's some very basics about nutrients that the vines use and the importance of taking foliar and soil tests. Now we're going to start getting into the meat of it. So first, how do you interpret a vineyard test report, whether it's a soil test report or a foliar test report? So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is I'm going to show you examples of what these test reports look like, and we're going to go through them and make sure that you understand what everything stands for on a test report. All right, so this is an example of a test report from Midwest Laboratories. This test report was done for Kevin Fowler at Old Crow Vineyard in Lanesboro, Minnesota, and Kevin encouraged me to use his soil and foliar test reports, so I did get his permission to use these today. Midwest Labs is one of the companies that you can go through to get a soil or a foliar test. You can also go through your university. So University of Minnesota does offer soil and foliar test reports. I don't know if Iowa State University does them. Joe can tell you a lot more about that. But basically, any state you live in typically has a university testing service, but Midwest Labs is a good private one to go through. They typically get their results back to you within a few days, and it's really nice turnaround. So this is an example of what a report might look like. Again, this is a soil test. All right, so look at where my arrows are pointing, and I'm just going to lead you through this. So this is organic matter. You'll also see it abbreviated as OM%. And then it's showing you that your soil has 2.8% organic matter in it. That means 2.8% of your soil mass is organic matter, like decomposed leaves, decomposed worms, and roots, and things like that. All right, if we keep going, this is showing phosphorus. And phosphorus can be tested in 3 different ways. A weak bray, a strong bray, or an Olsen. Those are just 3 different types of tests that they do to figure out your phosphorus concentration in the sample. And so we're going to look at the P2, or the strong bray. And it's showing that we have 64 parts per million phosphorus in the soil. And parts per million is just the concentration. Don't overthink that. And then we go to potassium, showing 197 parts per million in your soil. Magnesium, and you can also look at your calcium or your sodium, but I want to draw your attention to soil pH. This is a really important thing in a soil test, and I think sometimes growers tend to overlook it. Your soil pH is really important because your soil pH determines which nutrients and how much of those nutrients are actually available for your plants to take up. So sometimes we might have a really high concentration of phosphorus in our soil, but if your pH is off from the optimal range, that can mean that your plant is actually not able to take it up from the soil. It's being bound into the soil chemically so that your plant can't take it up. So we want that soil pH to be in the right range for our vines, and there is an optimal range. So on this soil test report, his pH is 6.8. Okay, and then I want to draw your attention to these little letters that we see next to each number, and that is saying VH stands for very high, medium, or M stands for medium, H stands for high. So they're attempting to tell you what that number means relatively. And in this case, you know, let's go back to organic matter. They're saying on this report that a 2.8 is medium. Now, based on university research from Iowa State and University of Minnesota, that's not quite accurate. And so I'm going to show you examples during this presentation of times where you want to check those values yourself next to university recommendations to see if those numbers are actually accurate for grapes, because we have research specifically for grapes to tell you if your levels are off or if they're optimum. So you can look at these little letters in the soil report, but don't put too much stake in them. It's better to check those yourself. These nutrients down here are, again, your secondary macro and your micronutrients. And then here's your nitrate over here. Now, not every soil report is going to give nitrogen or nitrate, in other words. A lot of times when you go through your universities, they actually won't tell you your nitrate concentrations unless you specifically ask for that. The reason is nitrate in your soil, or nitrogen, it's constantly moving. It's a very mobile nutrient. So if you take a soil sample and it says you've got 2 parts per million of nitrate, that might change really drastically within just a week or within just a day or two. It's very volatile. So we don't always test for that. It's not that valuable in a soil report. What's a lot more valuable for estimating your nitrogen content is your organic matter, and we're going to get into that later. All right, so here's a foliar test report. As you can see, it's sort of similar. This is also from Midwest Labs for the same vineyard. It's showing our nutrients up here in the first column, and then your concentration of those nutrients in the second column, and then the relative amounts and what those mean for your vines. Again, some of these I don't consider to be consistent with university research, so just take those letters with a grain of salt. And then here's, oh, yep, they're stating what the norms are. So again, concentration and your relative level and your nutrient. Pretty simple. Okay, so after you know what you're looking on your soil looking for on your test report, the next step is to determine from that which nutrients you need to add to your vineyard and how much. So here's the simple process that we use to do that. First, identify which nutrients are deficient in your soil, and then from there, you're going to calculate the difference between how much your soil has based on the report and how much your soil needs. And in a lot of cases, that might be 0. You don't want to assume that you need to add every nutrient every year. A lot of the time, our soil is doing a good job itself of supplying the nutrients we need. So hopefully every year, you're just tweaking those nutrients a little bit. You shouldn't be in a situation where you're adding tons of fertilizer every year. So this is how much of the nutrient you're going to be adding to your soil through the fertilizer. That's the step we're going to be calculating first. With pH, that's something else I want to mention. Check if your pH is low, high, or if it's in an optimal range based on your test report. All right, so let's go through it. I'm still using Kevin's example here. So here's a soil test report again, and I've just summarized some of the numbers here on the left that are important to look at. So pH is at 6.8. His organic matter percentage is at 2.8%. And then phosphorus, he's got 60 parts per million. If we look at the the P1, one of those tests. Potassium is at 197 parts per million. And another one I want to look at and draw your attention to here is boron, which is at 0.6 parts per million down here. I don't put too much stake into copper or iron on a soil test unless I've actually looked at the leaves of my vines and seen that there are symptoms of deficiency, like discoloration. Okay, so what if the report doesn't give a low, medium, high range to tell us relatively where our numbers are? Or what if, like I mentioned before, you want to be able to actually check that out on your own in order to come to your own conclusions based on university research, rather than relying on what the soil test says as far as low, medium, and high. And then what about pH and organic matter, where on your soil test, it doesn't say if those are low, medium, or high, it just states the number. And there are a couple of resources here that I'm going to be using throughout this presentation, and this is what I recommend that you use as well. So this first one is an article that just got published on our website a few days ago. So this is written by myself and Carl Rosen, but it is based on research that was done in Minnesota, Iowa, through Iowa State, and a couple of other universities in the Midwest. So this is the link to that if you want to copy and paste that link. Another resource that I'm going to be using and that I recommend for you is the Nutrient Management Guide for Commercial Fruit and Vegetable Growers in Minnesota. This is a really great guide, and I'm going to be using it and going back to it a lot throughout this presentation. So this is what these two guides look like. The Nutrient Management Guide here on the left. This is a long guide. I don't know how many pages. It might be 40 pages. Anyway, it's a PDF download. Has tons of great information. You should really, really download that guide. And then the one on the right, this is just a screenshot of that article that we just published a few days ago. Okay, so let's say I open up that article, this one on the right, and in that article there is a table that helps you interpret what your test results mean and whether those values are considered low, medium, high, or excessive for grapevines. So from my soil test, again, my pH is 6.8, like I said before. And all right, so I go over to my table. I see that it says that for grapevines, a pH between 6 and 7 is optimal. Anything above 7 is considered high. My pH on that soil test report, or Kevin's pH, is 6.8. And so it's saying that's within that optimal range. So I don't need to do anything about my pH. My organic matter percent is 2.8. And if I go to this table, I'm seeing that at 2.8, anything less than 3.1% is considered low. All right, so that might be something I want to think about. My phosphorus, or P, is 60. So I'm going to go over here to phosphorus. And it says for soils with a pH of 7.4 or less, you look at these numbers. But if your pH is 7.4 or more, you look at these numbers. So that's one of the reasons why, again, it's really important to look at pH. Mine is 6.8. So I'm going to look over here, pH of 7.4 or less. So phosphorus level is 60. That would put us in a very high range. It's above 25. All right, potassium, 197. Let's go down here. 197 is also considered very high or even excessive. Boron, 0.6. Now, on the soil report, it said it was low, but if we look at the research, we go to boron, 0.6, that's considered medium. It's not considered low. And so we might want to add some boron to the soil, but we don't need to be too worried about it. Copper, 0.5. Let's go down here. 0.5 is actually considered high for grapes in the Midwest, which again is different from what the report said. So it's important to use these research-based recommendations and check these numbers yourself. All right, so if I go back to my report, again, these are just the same numbers, and I'm just showing you, again, how they would relate to your soil test report. So the two things that I'm going to be looking at here and considering are my pH, which is good, organic matter is low, that's important to consider. I'll get to that later. And then my boron is considered medium. So Kevin also got a foliar test done, and we're looking at these levels here. And again, we want to compare them against university research to see if those levels are okay. So that's what I'm going to be doing next. I look in my article that I referenced before, and there's a handy table in there that shows you if you got these numbers, what do they mean? So they show the nutrient sufficiency level in grape petioles, which are the part of the grapevine that you're going to sample in order to do your foliar test. Okay, and so Kevin actually took his samples. Well, he told me he took his samples during veraison. So we're going to be using those numbers in order to figure out if the numbers on our foliar test are in the right range. And okay, so I looked at that table and I figured out that his nitrogen concentration, which is 1.81, based on that table, it's high. Phosphorus, again, based on the table, this number 0.6 is considered high. Potassium, it's actually considered low. Iron was sufficient, copper low, and boron is considered medium. All right, so potassium. When I looked at the soil test, the levels on the soil test of potassium were very high. And I don't know if you noticed, but then on the foliar test, like I showed in the last slide, his potassium levels were very low. So what that means is even though the potassium levels in the soil were very high, the vine is not getting all the potassium that it needs. And so why could that be? And there are a couple of possibilities here. The first one is maybe there was an error in sampling. Maybe he took the wrong leaves from the plant, or maybe he took the sample at the wrong time of year. It's really important that when you do tissue sampling, you're taking your sample at either bloom or at veraison. And the other option is maybe the vines really aren't taking up sufficient potassium from the soil. So even though that potassium is present in high levels in the soil, maybe the plant's not getting it for some reason. Maybe the pH is bounding that nutrient up in the soil, or maybe the root system is stunted for some reason. So those roots are just physically not able to explore the soil and get that potassium from it. So the first thing I want to do is I want to look at the pH of that soil. And on the soil test, it said we have 6.8. And there's this really handy resource that's very available online. It's called the pH Nutrient Availability Chart. So we're going to look at this chart. All right, so it's 6.8, which was the pH of Kevin's soil. We look at this and we see that at that pH, we should have pretty good levels of potassium. That's what this wide blue bar means. We should also have good levels, good uptake of nitrogen and phosphorus, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. However, at a soil pH of 6.8, we might be low in a couple of these micronutrients. But we shouldn't be concerned about soil pH, and we shouldn't be concerned about potassium being available to the plant in Kevin's case. So then what's happening? I talked to Kevin, and he actually told me that he took that foliar sample in late September, and that was way later than veraison. Veraison was about the beginning of August. And so it's really important that that sample is actually taken at bloom or veraison in order for the results to be valid. And this sample, because Kevin took that, that sample too late, and that was actually during the harvest season, it might have actually been after his crop was harvested, that potassium had already been depleted in the plant from the fruit ripening. And so that's why it showed up low in our sample, is because that fruit had already taken a lot of it up and it was gone from the plant. It doesn't mean there's any actual issue going on, just that he sampled too late. So it's really important to sample on time. Okay, so in conclusion for Kevin's vineyard, which is actually pictured here, all he really needs to add is boron and nitrogen. First, because we saw that boron levels were medium, but not optimal, so we're going to add some of that. And then nitrogen. He has low organic matter in his vineyard, 2.8. And so he also has a high yielding variety. This is Frontenac Blanc. So we want to add a little bit of nitrogen in there every year just to keep those vines pumping. But that's all we're going to do, not too much. Okay, so from there, we know what nutrients we need to add, and we know what rates we want to add those nutrients at, but then how do we calculate how much actual fertilizer to apply? Some critical reminders before we begin this part. The amount of nutrient to add, which is what we just talked about, is not the same as the amount of fertilizer to add. Okay, so no fertilizer product that you're going to apply to your vineyard is 100% composed of that nutrient. Every fertilizer product is just composed of a certain percentage of that nutrient, and the rest of that fertilizer product is something else. So if I say add 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre, I do not mean add 50 pounds of fertilizer per acre. They're different. So each fertilizer has a certain percentage of certain nutrients in it. In this fertilizer that's pictured here, it says 10, 20, 20. So this is an NPK fertilizer, and it's saying that it contains 10% nitrogen, 20% phosphorus, and 20% potassium, NPK. So if you need to add 100 pounds of nitrogen to your soil and you're using this fertilizer, you can't just add 100 pounds of that fertilizer. It's only 10% N and 90% composed of other stuff. So if you're using a 10% nitrogen fertilizer and you want to achieve 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre added, you're actually going to need to add 1,000 pounds per acre of this fertilizer. This is the equation here that we use. It's very simple. I'm going to be going through this equation later in the presentation. But first I want to show you some common fertilizer options before we go into this. Because after figuring out, what nutrients do you need to add, the next step is deciding what fertilizers do I want to use to add those nutrients in. And there are a lot of NPK fertilizers out there. These are just some examples of some common ratios of NPK. There are a lot of potential mixes to fit those nutrient needs. And if you're working with a fertilizer rep, they actually might be able to custom mix something for you too. If you just need phosphorus, you don't need the other nutrients. These are some examples of phosphorus fertilizers. And these are examples of potassium, in other words, potash fertilizers. So as you can see, potassium chloride, that's really heavy in potassium, 60% potassium. Let's see, potassium magnesium sulfate, which is something where if you need to add magnesium to your soil in addition to potassium, you can use this. But this is 0022, so it's only 22% potassium. This is a list of nitrogen fertilizers. By the way, everything I'm showing in these slides is based again on that guide, that nutrient management guide that I showed a picture of earlier. So this is a list of nitrogen sources. As you can see, the rates or the percentages of nitrogen, the concentration in the product varies a lot. Urea is an example of one that has a lot of nitrogen in it, 46%, which means if you choose to apply urea, you're going to be applying less per acre than you would if you choose something like monoammonium phosphate, which is only 11% nitrogen. But if you need to add phosphorus, it's got a high percentage of that. So there are a lot of options to choose from. There are tons and tons of options for these secondary macro and these micronutrients listed here. So I'm not listing them on the slide, but you can turn to page 10 of that nutrient management guide and find them there. All right, so first, determine how much actual nutrient you need to add per acre based on those concentrations on your soil test. And the nutrient management guide gives these super handy tables to make this very easy for us. What they're saying in this table is if your soil test said this in this first column, then do this. That's basically what the table is doing. And it doesn't have just grapes, it has other fruit crops as well. So let's say our soil test showed 14 parts per million of phosphorus. And we have an established vineyard. We're not just planting it for the first time. Then go to grapes, and we see that we need to add 75 pounds per acre of phosphorus based on the soil test report. Isn't that easy? I love how these tables make it so easy to figure this out. I use them all the time. Similar table for potassium. So let's say your soil test says you have 82 parts per million potassium. You need to add 100 pounds per acre of potassium to your soil. Example for magnesium as well, calcium, boron. They have these tables for a lot of different nutrients in the guide. All right, so what do you do about nitrogen then? Because I mentioned that on a lot of soil tests, they're not going to say how much nitrogen you have in your soil. Instead, we want to base that on the organic matter percentage on the soil test, as well as looking at your foliar test and seeing if your nitrogen levels are in sync with what they should be. So use this guide again, that's just the name of the guide, to reiterate. And then based on what this says in the guide, it says if you have low organic matter, you should be adding 30 pounds per acre per year to your vineyard if your vineyard is already established. If you're planting a new vineyard and you have low pH, you should be adding 60 pounds per acre of nitrogen per year. Medium organic matter, 20 pounds per acre, so not as much. High organic matter soil, you only need 10 pounds per acre per year or less. Maybe some years you're not going to be adding any nitrogen. But nitrogen is really helpful if you have a low organic matter soil just to make sure that your vines are as vigorous as they should be. Over applying nitrogen can be a bad thing because then your vines just might become over vigorous. And I know growing up on a pretty heavy soil in Iowa, vigor can be a big problem, and that can take away energy from fruit production. So make sure you're applying some nitrogen if you need to, but not too much. Okay, so to calculate the fertilizer rate based on the pounds per acre of nutrient you need, that's the next step. So you're going to choose what fertilizer to use, and then you're going to calculate the fertilizer rate per acre. And in order to do this, there's a simple calculation that we use. It's very easy. This is the most complex this math is going to get during this presentation. So basically what you do is you're going to divide the nutrient recommendation. So if that guide said you needed to apply, let's say 100 pounds per acre, you're going to divide that by the concentration of that nutrient in the fertilizer, and that's going to tell you how many pounds per acre of that fertilizer you need to apply. So here's an example. I'm going to move away from Kevin's vineyard now. I'm going to go to Paul. Paul's an imaginary person. But Paul figured out from his soil test that he needs to add 50 pounds per acre of phosphorus to his vineyard. And he decided from that list of fertilizers that he wants to use superphosphate, which is a 0-20-0, which means that it contains 20% phosphorus. Okay, so he's going to use this equation that I showed in the last slide. And in Paul's case, all right, so 50 is the amount of phosphorus he needs to add. He's going to divide that by 0.2 because it's a 20% phosphorus fertilizer, so 0.2, and that's going to equal out to 250, and that is 250 pounds per acre of superphosphate that he needs to add to his vineyard. But maybe it gets a little more complicated than that. Maybe Paul also needs to add nitrogen and potassium to his vineyard, not just the phosphorus. So he needs to add 20 pounds of nitrogen and 100 pounds of potassium in addition to that 50 pounds of phosphorus. So in total, he needs 20, 50, 100. And if we cut those down to a ratio and try to figure out, okay, what ratio of NP and K does he need to add? Because that's going to be really helpful when you're trying to figure out what NPK fertilizer you need to use. So the rough ratio, approximately, of 20, 50, and 100 would narrow down to about 5, 10, 25. And there actually are NPK fertilizers that have this exact ratio. And so those would be good to consider. And you can talk to your fertilizer rep to try to get a fertilizer with that good NPK ratio that you're looking for. That's what I would really recommend. You know, if you're working with Nutrien, Heartland Co-op, or your local co-op, try to work with them to find a fertilizer with the ratio that you need. And then you're going to calculate how much you need to add. So then the question is, how do you calculate that when you've got 3 different concentrations of 3 different nutrients that you need to add? And I would go with the one that is most limited. So your potassium in this case, you need to add 100 pounds of potassium per acre. So that would be the most limited. And I would go with that then, which means you're going to have a little bit excess of the others, but that's okay. It's better to be safe than sorry. So we need to add 100 pounds of K per acre, divide that by the concentration of K in that fertilizer, which would be 0.25 or 25%. That equals out to 24. So that's 400. So that's 400 pounds per acre of that fertilizer mix that you need to add to your vineyard. I hope that makes sense. I can't see you guys nodding, which would typically be very helpful for me in a presentation like this, to see if you're nodding or scratching your head to see if you understand, but hopefully that's clear. If you're working with a fertilizer rep like Nutrien, Heartland, or another local co-op, what you're gonna do is, and this is what I would recommend. I would recommend showing them your test report and telling them, based on that test report, which nutrients that you have decided that you need to add to your vineyard and how much. The reason I say that you should calculate this on your own, which is what I was already showing how to do, is that a lot of the reps that work for these big co-ops, they mostly work with corn and soybean growers. They don't work with grapes frequently. There are some who work with grapes frequently, but most of them do not. And so it's helpful for both you and for them if you tell them which nutrients and what concentrations you need to add to your vineyard, because that helps you make sure that you're getting the right recommendations. If they open their corn and soybean nutrient guide and they try to interpret your soil test based on that, you're likely to get a recommendation that has way, way, way too much nitrogen being recommended. So have those concentrations figured out ahead of time before you go to your rep, and then tell them the area that you need to fertilize, either in acres or square footage, and then let them recommend a fertilizer mix to you in an application rate based on your situation. All right, so when you're applying fertilizer to your vineyard, here are a few things to keep in mind. First, you really only need to be applying that fertilizer to the rows, not the aisles. If you're applying it to an established vineyard. If you're applying this to a field that you're planning to plant a new vineyard into, then you want to fertilize the whole field. But if you've already planted your vines, you really don't need to be applying fertilizer to the area in between the rows. The reason is if you fertilize your aisles, you're really just feeding the grass. I'll show in the next slide why that's the case. And so you want to calculate the square footage of your rows. You know, if your rows are 2.5 feet wide, in other words, if your sprayed herbicide strip under your vines is 2.5 feet wide, you're going to use that and the row length to calculate the square footage that you need to fertilize. And then you just buy the appropriate amount of fertilizer based on that. And it's really going to decrease the amount of fertilizer that you need to buy. And you're going to use a targeted spreader to apply it to just those rows. So why is this the case? Well, there have been studies done that have showed that the majority of grapevine roots are located within that row or within that herbicide strip, and only a small portion of them are located in the aisles between the vines. And this might vary from vineyard to vineyard, but this is a general trend. And one of the reasons for this is because between your rows, you've got grass growing. That grass is going to compete with the grapevine roots, and the grapevine roots don't want to be competing with grass, so they typically just stay in their rows. The other thing is you're driving a truck and a tractor down between your rows all the time. That's compacting the soil. That's making an environment that's not ideal for grapevine roots to grow in, so they tend to stay where they are. So then you can actually use a targeted fertilizer spreader to make sure that you're only applying your fertilizer to the rows and not into the grass. There are models of these that are specifically made for vineyards and orchards that you can purchase. Here's an example of one here. It's sold as just a broadcast spreader, but then it comes with this attachment that you latch onto the end that makes sure when your fertilizer is shot out, it shoots it into the rows. But you can also make these yourself. So this is an example of a DIY sort of jerry-rig situation that Jameson Lindquist of Southern Minnesota made. He was working for Chankaska Creek Winery at the time. That worked pretty well for him. And so all he did was buy a fertilizer spreader at Fleet Farm, and then he attached a wooden knee on the end of it so that when that fertilizer is shot out from the spreader, it goes into the rows and not the grass. Pretty nifty. A note on adding organic matter. In the first example from Kevin's Vineyard, it had a low organic matter soil of 2.8%. It's pretty hard to change your organic matter level once the vineyard is planted. So it might just be that you're going to live with the organic matter level that you have. But if you have a really low organic matter soil and you really want to add some to your vineyard to increase the vigor of your vines, there are a few ways you can do that. Now, none of these ways are going to change your organic matter immediately. These are gradual processes. Even if you're adding manure or compost to your vineyard, you're typically going to do these in small amounts, and it's going to take several years in order for you to really see an increase in your organic matter that's significant. But some of the methods that you can use are spreading manure, spreading compost or composted manure over your rows, or you can plant cover crops actually in your grapevine rows under the vines. This is what a manure or a compost spreader might look like. I actually do not know anybody who has one of these specifically for vineyards in Minnesota, but it is something that growers I work with have expressed interest in. So I've looked into models. One company I know of in the Midwest that can source these is called Ag Resource Inc., which is in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. If you're going to add organic matter in this way, you know, the best time to do it is before planting the vineyard. But if you're going to do it while the vineyard is already established, apply these in fall or spring. Composted manure is preferred over raw manure for various reasons, including volatilization, but also food safety. You don't want to get that in contact with fruit, and so there are food safety regulations involved with spreading raw manure in a fruit crop like this. You want to, if you can, till or plow it into the soil, and that's what makes this difficult because we don't really encourage tilling within the grapevine rows any more than just a really light surface cultivation, because that can lead to breakage of those grapevine roots and grapevine injury. This is what a perennial undervine cover crop would look like. This is from my master's research where we're studying the effect of perennial cover crops planted under the vines like you see in the row to the left to just regular conventional herbicide strips. And this is a way to gradually add organic matter to your vineyard over the years as those grasses go through decomposition cycles. So some species that you can try for this are fescues, specifically creeping red fescue is the type that we used in our study. You can also try bluegrass, white clover, or just grow the natural vegetation underneath the rows. If you let the natural vegetation or a perennial cover crop grow, I would pay really close attention to your nitrogen levels in your foliar test and make sure that those aren't getting too depleted. So here's a couple of resources. These are the same ones that I've been referencing throughout this presentation and what I used to show my slides. The tissue and soil nutrient testing for cold climate grapes is the first link. And then the second link is that nutrient management guide for commercial fruit and vegetable crops in Minnesota. And this actually isn't my last slide. I included another example for us to go through in case we had time. And it seems like we do have time. But I was thinking maybe we would take questions first and then go through this example in case there's anyone who doesn't want to stick around for this. Does that sound okay?
There were several questions in the chat box and things. So,
okay.
So you want to wrap up your slide and then I'll come back and give you the questions and so you don't have to go searching.
So I should do this example first. It's like.
Oh, sorry. This is the example. Sorry. No, I'll just give you the questions then. So,
okay. Yeah, it's like 6 or 7 slides.
Okay. Yeah, we'll do the questions and come back to the second example then.
All right.
Okay, so you had asked about soil testing facilities in Iowa. We have Waypoint, Minnesota Valley, and the one that you had mentioned, Minnesota.
Midwest Labs.
Midwest Labs was the other one. So those are all pretty commonly used here because ISU does not do soil testing. We just do the interpretations for fruit crops. And then I think Terry Bockenstead had a question going way back to your soil testing depth regarding why test at an 18-inch depth, considering you can't make suitable changes at that depth.
So I don't think that was a recommendation I made in this presentation because I wasn't talking about soil testing in this presentation. I actually don't recommend sampling at 18 inches. When I recommend soil sampling procedures to growers, I'm telling them to sample from 0 to 8 inches of the soil.
Okay, I'm not sure where that came from because I missed that as well. Let me see. The other question came from Terry as well that I saw. Do you ever look at cation exchange capacity, especially in relation to high CEC and total potassium, what's actually available when you're under those high conditions?
Sure. I don't look at that very often. The only times when I would really dig down to looking that in depth, the cation exchange capacity, if I'm seeing nutrient levels that are low in the plant and high in the soil, and I'm really trying to troubleshoot and figure out, diagnose why that would be. That's the only time when I really dig down that deep. I guess another example would be if somebody needs to amend their soil pH by adding sulfur to decrease their soil pH. A cation exchange capacity does come into play there. So there's some more, in-depth times that I would use that, but not too commonly.
Thanks. And that was the only questions that I had saw, so I guess I'll open it up. Just go ahead and unmute yourself because I'm driving to a better location to present from. So if you got questions, shoot them out.
Is there a certain time each year you would recommend doing soil testing?
Yep, so soil testing, I like to do it in the fall. A convenient time for growers is after harvest is done. And that still leaves you plenty of time before the soil freezes over. So I like that time of year. The other time of year is the spring. And summer, between about June to mid-August, that's not an ideal time to do soil testing just because so much is changing, the root systems are really active and there's more flux going on. So spring or fall is good. If you do it in the fall, you're mainly doing that to figure out what nutrients you need to add the following spring. Because often the soil test you get back in the fall usually doesn't leave you quite enough time to amend your soil before winter comes. But if you have time, there's nothing wrong with that. Whereas if you're soil testing in the spring, then you can use that to figure out what fertilizer you need to add that year. But one thing I want to mention now that, Chris, you mentioned the timing of soil testing, I wanted to also mention the timing of nitrogen application. In the Midwest, for cold climate grapevines, we really, really strongly recommend against applying nitrogen in the fall. Because if you apply nitrogen in the fall, one of the things that can happen is the vines can actually react to that by growing new growth. And we don't want them to be growing new growth in the fall. We want them to be acclimating for winter and stopping their growth. The other thing that can happen with fall applied nitrogen is it just leaches off during the winter. So whatever you applied is just gone and not available to your vines in the spring. So spring is the best time to apply nitrogen. I know that's not what you asked, Chris, but you reminded me that I wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
If there's not any other immediate questions right now, I want to go through this example. This is just a quick example that goes all the way through those steps that I was talking about. And if you have other questions, you can always enter them in the chat while I'm going. All right, so here's another soil test. This is from another vineyard in southern Minnesota. Just for context, this vineyard was growing a variety of cold climate grape varieties, but it is on a very flat site that was ideal corn and soybean ground, but not ideal grape growing ground, like super heavy soil, a pretty high water table. Even though he had it tiled, the water table was so high that sometimes you're walking through the vineyard kind of sloshing around. So his vineyard was having some trouble. A lot of his Marquette vines were dying. And so we wanted to see what was going on. So here's a soil test, organic matter 7.8%, pH 7.4. So if we remember the optimal range for pH of 6.7, 7.4 is a little high. Phosphorus 14 parts per million, potassium 300 plus parts per million, calcium 5,800, magnesium 406. So first let's interpret the soil test. I'm going to compare those numbers in the test to the recommended ranges for grapevines. This is from that article online that I've been referencing. So pH 7.4. Let's look at it in the table. 7.4 is considered pretty high, and it's outside of that optimal range. Organic matter 7.8%. If we look at the table, 7.8 would be considered high. If we look at then phosphorus P, and they use the Bray 1 test, we've got two options here, two columns to look at. Phosphorus with soils with pH of more than 7.4. So then we will use this column. Our phosphorus level was 14, and it says that 14 is considered high. Then your potassium levels were 300 or more parts per million, and that's considered very high or even excessive. Calcium levels 5,800. That's considered really, really extremely high. So I don't know if this grower had been adding calcium fertilizer to his soil, or maybe it just happens to be a high calcium soil, but this is a case where I would never recommend that grower to add calcium to his vineyard, whether it's foliar or soil. It's just those levels are excessive. Magnesium 406, that is also considered excessive. And so again, this is an example where I would never recommend that grower to apply magnesium to his vineyard. Those levels are excessive already. All right, so high, high, medium to high for that phosphorus, and everything else was pretty high. So pretty fertile vineyard, not a surprise. But then I want to figure out this pH. The pH is high. And then the issue that may arise there is it may result in low uptake of micronutrients like iron, manganese, boron, copper, or zinc, which is something where if we might see in our foliar samples low uptake of those nutrients, or we might even see leaves with deficiency symptoms like discoloration. So we want to look at this, again, this is that pH and nutrient availability chart, and a 7.4 would lie right here. So I draw this line up and I look at how thick are these bars. If they're thin, that means that these nutrients might be limiting. So at 7.4 pH, we're seeing the availability of iron, manganese, boron, copper, and zinc start to deplete. But our macronutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, and then sulfur, calcium, magnesium, those are still available in high levels at 7.4. But then we might be concerned about this. We might say, all right, I need to do a foliar test and see if any of those micronutrients are deficient in these vines. And so we did a foliar test at this vineyard. And these are the levels in the foliar test. So this, you can see this looks like a different output than before. This was not from Midwest Labs. This is from University of Minnesota. And these are the nutrient levels down here. And so I'm going to, again, compare that to the article online that I've been referencing. These are the nutrient sufficiency levels in the grape petioles, which is the type of, the part of the leaf that you sample for tissue tests. So I'm going to not go through this all right now, but you just look at these levels, compare them to the table. And this test was taken during veraison, beginning of August. So, you know, phosphorus, 0.56, that's in this range. That means it's in the optimal range. And boron, 42, if I look at boron here, it's in the optimal range, but it's not high. You know, these are the sufficiency ranges, but they're pretty wide. So for either of these nutrients, based on the foliar test, we could say, you know, they're not above this range, so maybe we could add some. But in general, we're sitting pretty good for all of these nutrients. All right, so which nutrients to add? I'm going to compare to the recommendations in the guide. So again, medium high on that phosphorus, and also maybe boron based on that foliar test. We might need to add that. So if I look at the phosphorus recommendations for fruit crops outlined in that nutrient management guide that I showed, I want to look at that, that phosphorus level since it was considered medium to high in the foliar test, 14 parts per million in the soil test. So what does that mean? All right, so I'm going to go to this table in the guide. It's between 14 is between 11 and 20. So based on this guide, it's telling us we can add 75 pounds per acre of phosphorus to our vineyard in order to get those levels optimum. So I need to add 75 pounds per acre of phosphorus. What's the next step? The next step is to decide what fertilizer to use and how much. The shortcut here is go to your fertilizer rep and have them sell you a product. But if you want a more DIY solution, you can choose your fertilizer type yourself and calculate the rate. Just make sure you're researching all these fertilizer types and making sure that you know what you're applying to your vineyard before you dump it on. So in this case, we're going to use superphosphate, which is 20% phosphorus. You're going to calculate the rate per acre of superphosphate next. In order to achieve 75 pounds per acre of actual phosphorus, we're going to use this equation again that I introduced earlier. Very simple equation. So the pounds of nutrient recommended was 75. You're going to divide that by the concentration of nutrient in your fertilizer, which is 20%. So we're going to write 0.2, not 20, but 0.2. And that equals out to 375 pounds per acre of actual superphosphate to apply to the vineyard. Lastly, in this example, let's consider amending that pH in order to prevent future issues, because that pH was pretty high, 7.4. No problems due to that we're seeing yet, but there could be in the future. So to lower that pH, you use sulfur to lower pH and lime to increase pH. So in this case, we're going to be adding sulfur to decrease it, and we want to decrease it to about 7.0 because that's in that optimal range. To do this, we know that we need to add 500 pounds of sulfur to decrease the pH by 0.5 pH units. So if we want to go from 7.4 to 7, here's my math in case you're curious. We need to add 400 pounds of sulfur per acre to decrease it by that much. You can incorporate sulfur by cultivation. It's typically going to take between 6 to 12 months for that to work. When you're adding sulfur, the cheapest way to do that and the most efficient is to add elemental sulfur, which is just sulfur. There are also other sulfur fertilizers like ammonium sulfate that you can add, but you're going to have to add substantially more. Again, here are those resources that I listed before and I've been referencing throughout the talk. So that is all I have for you today. And we just have about 5 more minutes left if anybody has any remaining questions.
So Annie, I'll comment on your last example.
Yeah, go ahead.
I see that all the time here where we're high pH, high calcium, high potassium, high magnesium. And in my experience, at least in Iowa, we're in eastern Iowa and western Iowa, typically I'll see that high calcium was an application of calcium, or that high potassium was an application of potassium to offset a deficiency induced by the high calcium or magnesium that was out in that field. So it's not super uncommon to see that example here at all.
Okay, good to know.
Hey, Annie, this is Terry.
Hey, Terry.
Hey, getting back to the CEC, I know I don't want to get too technical here, but on your first example, if that CEC was 22, I like to base a lot of my recommendations on the percent base saturation in the soil of potassium, simply because if that first sample was 22, 197 pounds might only be in the medium range. Does that make sense to you?
Yep, yep.
So, organic matter, I mean, you're talking probably a sandy loam soil with an 11 CEC. If you're talking a 22 CEC, you're talking a black heavy clay loam soil. So maybe that will help some of the vineyard growers understand the soil that they have. The lower the number of the CEC, you're probably going to have a lower organic matter as well. And your second example where you had your organic matter of 7.8, I would suggest, or I would guess that would be a peat type soil.
A what type soil?
Peat, a heavy peat type soil.
He doesn't have a peat soil. It was just like a really heavy clay loam.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, but no, I know what you mean. The peat soils are extremely high in organic matter.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments about the CEC. And I guess I didn't talk much about that because I didn't want to get, too technical in this presentation for somebody who's not familiar with the rest of this content. But no, you're absolutely right. And if somebody wants to learn more about CEC and what Terry was talking about, the nutrient guide that I've been talking about, nutrient management for fruit and vegetable crops, that describes that, and you can learn more there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Annie, there's one more question in the chat box. If you want to grab that one.
Sure. Where are the pounds per acre recommendations coming from? Yeah, so I actually included lots of charts about that. That is, or maybe you're referencing the last slide. I'm not sure. Are you asking in general or just about this last slide on sulfur? In general. Okay. So those are coming from, well, basically they're based on research that was done at University of Minnesota and Iowa State University, as well as I believe North Dakota State and South Dakota State were all involved in that. And what they did was they did a huge survey of soil in vineyards throughout the Midwest. And they were looking at they were determining what are the optimal nutrient ranges for grapevines based on that, specifically for our region. And all of those pounds per acre recommendations are all published in that nutrient management guide that I've been talking about throughout this presentation. So if I can go back in my talkaways. So for example, a table like this, that's coming out of that guide. You see my question about what acreage to cover. I wasn't monitoring the chat during my talk, so I didn't see that question. I would have to go back to it, or maybe Joe saw that. Oh. When calculating the acreage to cover, you only calculate the square footage in the herbicide bands under the vines. Yeah, that's correct. Yep, so you don't need to be fertilizing the grass in between the vines. You just want to apply your fertilizer to the herbicide strip underneath the vines. And, that varies, but typically it's about 2 to 2.5 feet wide. And then so you're going to multiply that by the length of your rows, add up all your rows together, and that's the square footage or the acreage that you're going to need to apply fertilizer to. So I work with a 15-acre vineyard in eastern Minnesota, and they just calculated that for their particular case, and they found out they only need to actually apply fertilizer to 3 acres total when they add up the square footage of their rows.
All right, looks like we got one last question for Annie.
What is it?
No, that was a question. Is there anyone time for one
Oh.
last question? Sorry. All right, I'm not seeing any, so
Okay.
thank you, Andy, very much for taking some time to chat with us here today, and nice to not have to make the trip down to Iowa to do it, right?
Yeah, I guess.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming in and chatting with us about soil fertility here today and foliar sampling. I guess we got a little bit of a break, and then 2 o'clock, hopefully I'll be at my destination and we'll talk Japanese beetles in the vineyard. So thanks everybody for jumping in and participating, and Andy, thanks again.
Thank you. Have a good conference, everyone.